He had one rule. One, don't get attached. Every employee knew it. Every executive feared it. And I, a black girl from nothing with student loan debt and secondhand heels, walked into his company and broke it. Not on purpose. That was the dangerous part. Before I tell you this story, I need you to do something for me. If you have ever walked into a room and felt like you had to shrink yourself just to survive in it, like button right now, because this story is about what happens when you stop shrinking, when you stop making yourself smaller so other people feel more comfortable. Stay with me for the next 25 minutes, because by the end of this, something in you is going to shift. I promise you that. I want to tell you where I come from because it matters. It matters more than people think it does when they look at me now, sitting in a corner office with my name on a door that used to belong to someone who never thought someone like me would ever touch it. I grew up in a house where the heat got cut off in February, where my mother worked 2 jobs, one during the day and one on weekends, and still came home and asked us how school was, like she hadn't just spent 12 hours on her feet. I was the oldest of 3, and from the time I was about 9 years old, I understood something that no child should have to understand so early, that I did not have the luxury of being average. Average wasn't going to save us. Average wasn't going to get my little brother his asthma medication or keep the lights on. I had to be extraordinary, not because someone told me I was special, because survival required it. I was the first person in my family to finish college, and I want you to understand what that felt like. Not the graduation day part, not the cap and gown part. I mean the 4 years before that. Working at a diner on weekends, eating ramen and calling it dinner, sending money home when I had it and pretending I was fine when I didn't. I graduated with honors and a debt that felt like a second mortgage on a house I didn't own. But I had my degree, and I had something nobody could take from me. I knew how to think, how to analyze, how to walk into any room and find the problem before anyone else even knew there was one. So when my best friend sent me a job listing for Caldwell & Pierce, one of the most elite financial consulting firms in the country, I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. I said, "Girl, people like us don't work there." And she looked at me dead in my eyes and said, "You are the smartest person I know. Send the application. The worst they can say is no." So I sent it. At 11:39 at night, in my apartment, in a t-shirt, half convinced it was pointless. They called me back in 48 hours. 4 rounds of interviews, each one more intense than the last. I pressed my one good blazer the night before the final round. I polished shoes that seen better days. I walked into that building and I told myself one thing: just be the most prepared person in the room. Not the loudest, not the most impressive, just the most prepared. And that's exactly what I was. They offered me the position of junior strategy analyst 3 days later. The first morning I walked in as an employee, the building felt different. Glass everywhere, marble floors, the kind of silence that money buys. I counted 2 other black women in the entire building, and one of them worked at the front desk. I smiled at her and she smiled back, and we both understood without saying a single word exactly what that moment meant. And then I saw him. Nathan Cole, CEO of Caldwell & Pierce. He was walking through the main floor with that kind of energy that makes a whole room go quiet without him saying anything. Tall, controlled, dressed like every detail of himself had been decided the night before. He didn't look around the room the way most powerful people do, looking to be acknowledged. He just moved through it, like the room was a thing to cross, not a thing to perform in. One of my new colleagues leaned over and whispered, almost without moving her lips, "Don't make eye contact. Don't try to make conversation. He doesn't do personal. That's his whole thing." I nodded, filed it away, and told myself, I'm not here to be noticed. I'm here to survive. It didn't take long to understand the culture of that place. High performance was the air everyone breathed. You delivered or you disappeared. There were no long lunches, no birthday cake in the break room, no hallway conversations that lasted more than 30 seconds, and at the center of it all was Nathan Cole's one non-negotiable rule: this is a professional environment, and relationships are a liability. He didn't just say it, he lived it. Everyone knew the story about his college friend, a man he'd brought into the company himself, someone he trusted, who crossed a personal line, and Nathan let him go without a second conversation. No second chances, no exceptions. The rule was the rule, and everyone operated inside it like it was oxygen, necessary and invisible. I respected it, honestly. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to build something. So I kept my head down, did my work, and stayed out of everyone's way. 3 weeks in, I was practically a ghost, and I was fine with that. Then came the elevator. It was late, maybe 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. The floor had emptied out hours ago, but I was still at my desk finishing a risk analysis report that I refused to let sit until morning. I finally packed up, hit the elevator button, stepped in, just me. And then, right as the doors were about to close, Nathan Cole stepped in. I looked straight ahead, didn't fidget, didn't smile, just stood there, professional, invisible, the way I'd been trained by 3 weeks of watching how that building worked. The silence was the kind that has weight. And then, out of nowhere, he said, "You're still here?" I don't know what made me say what I said next. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was just honesty. But I turned slightly and said, "The numbers don't care what time it is." He looked at me. Not a glance, a real look, the kind that takes a second longer than it should. And then the doors opened, and he walked out without another word. But something had shifted. I felt it, and I couldn't explain it, and I told myself to leave it exactly where it was. The next week, my report ended up on his desk. I don't know how, I didn't send it to him directly, but 2 days later, his assistant called me and said he wanted to see me. I walked to his office, convinced I'd done something wrong, convinced this was the moment I got quietly removed and sent back to the life I came from. Instead, he asked me 3 questions about my analysis, sharp, specific, the kind of questions that tell you the person asking them actually read every word. I answered all 3, directly, confidently, without softening anything to make him more comfortable. He nodded once, said, "That'll be all," and I walked out. 3 days after that, I was reassigned to a larger project. The whispers in the office changed tone, and I thought to myself, I don't know if I'm rising or if I'm walking towards something I don't have a name for yet. The project they put me on was not a junior-level assignment. It was a major client pitch, the kind that partners spent months preparing for. Putting me on it at my level was unusual enough that people noticed, and not everyone was happy about it. My direct manager made that clear almost immediately. Not loudly. People like that are never loud about it. It was in the small things. The way he'd say, "Are you sure you understand what the client is looking for?" in a tone that had nothing to do with the actual question. The way he'd simplify things for me in front of the group like I needed things broken down smaller. I documented every single one of those moments. Date, time, what was said, who was present, because I did not survive everything I survived to get caught off guard without receipts. And then pitch day came. I stood at the front of that room and I delivered, not because I was trying to prove something to anyone else, but because I'd put in the kind of work that doesn't allow for a bad outcome. The client asked hard questions, and I answered them without looking at my notes. The room went quiet in that particular way that happens when people realize they underestimated you. The client signed. I felt Nathan's presence in the back of the room before I saw him, and when it was over, in the middle of all the noise and handshakes, he caught my eye from across the room and gave me one slow nod, just one. No words, no applause, and somehow that nod hit harder than all of it combined because I understood what it meant. It meant, I see you, the real you.
A few weeks later, there was a company dinner. I almost didn't go. I'm naturally more comfortable doing the work than celebrating it, but I went. And somehow, in the middle of a room full of people and noise, Nathan and I ended up in the same conversation. It started professional, like everything between us always did, market trends, client strategy, the usual. And then slowly, like a door opening 1 inch at a time, it became something else. He asked me where I was from, not a small talk, I could tell the difference, but as a genuine question. I told him. He listened like people rarely listen, like he was actually taking it in and not just waiting for his turn to speak. I caught myself laughing at something he said, and I saw him for the first time almost smile. I went home that night and had a very serious conversation with myself. I said, "You know his rule. More importantly, you know your situation. You know what this job means, what it took to get here, who's counting on you back home. Do not confuse being seen for something it's not." I talked myself all the way back to solid ground, but the feeling didn't leave. And that was the part that scared me. Because here is something that doesn't get talked about enough, what it feels like as a Black woman to be truly seen by someone. Not the hyper-visible kind of seen, where you're only noticed when you're in the way, or when someone needs to use your excellence for their benefit. Not invisible either, but actually seen. Your mind, your sharpness, your layers. It is rare, and it is terrifying, because once someone sees you like that, you can't pretend they don't, and I could not pretend anymore. It was a Thursday. A storm rolled in fast, the kind that shuts the city down before you realize it's serious. I had no car, my rideshare kept canceling, I was stranded at the office at almost 10 o'clock at night, watching the rain hit the windows like it had something personal against the glass. And Nathan was still there.
I don't know if it was the storm or the lateness or just the accumulated weight of weeks of careful, deliberate distance, but something about that night dissolved the formality between us. We ended up talking in the empty conference room with coffee going cold on the table, and for 2 hours there were no titles, no hierarchy, no rule hanging over the room, just two people talking like human beings. He told me something real, something that wasn't polished or calculated, something about a loss that had reshaped him. And I didn't respond with the professional, measured response I'd trained myself to give in that building. I told him something back, something true, from the part of me I kept quiet at work. And then he said it. He said, "You're not like anyone I've built a wall against." I looked at him and said as calmly as I could manage, "That's not something you should say to an employee." He said, "I know." Neither of us moved, and the rain kept hitting the windows, and the coffee sat there getting colder, and something that had been building for months sat in that room between us, fully formed and impossible to pretend wasn't there. I went home that night, and I didn't sleep. Not because I was excited, though some part of me was, and I'm being honest with you because that's what this story deserves, but because I was also deeply, clearly aware of what I was standing near, the edge of something. And I knew with every part of my practical, clear-eyed, hard-earned sense that I had to be the one who decided what happened next. So I pulled back, professionally, carefully, completely. I kept every interaction clean and focused. I gave nothing extra. And he respected it. He didn't push, didn't crowd the space, but I felt the pull, the way he'd linger a half-second longer than necessary in a doorway, the way he'd choose my analysis to reference in a meeting when he had 6 others he could have used. And then my manager escalated, filed a formal complaint against me, vague, unprovable things wrapped in professional language. HR called me in. And I want you to hear this part carefully, because this is the part that mattered most. Nathan found out, and he came to me, ready to step in. I looked at him and said, "Don't. I fight my own battles." He stopped, and the way he looked at me in that moment, I knew I had just broken something open in him that his rule had been holding shut for years. I won the HR case on my own. Every date, every comment, every subtle undermining moment, documented, submitted, undeniable. My manager was reassigned, and 2 weeks later I was called in for a conversation about my future at the company. Senior Strategy Director. The promotion was real, significant, and mine. Nathan delivered the offer personally. We sat across from each other in his office, the same office I'd walked into months ago convinced I was about to be let go, and the air between us carried everything we'd never said and everything we both understood we weren't going to say, because some things don't need to be spoken to be true. I accepted the promotion, and then I said something I'd been quietly preparing for weeks. I said, I respect you, and I need you to respect what I've built here, what I'm still building. He held my gaze for a long moment, and then he nodded, not the professional dismissive nod from our early days, a different one, the kind that means, I understand, and you're right. He pulled back, fully, genuinely, with the grace of a man who actually understood what respect looked like when it came from someone who'd earned the right to demand it. I walked out of that office different than I'd walked in, not louder, not harder, just clearer, about who I was, about what I was worth, and about the difference between wanting to be someone's exception and being your own standard. Here's what I learned in that building, and I need you to receive this, so stay with me. Power is not about being the loudest person in the room. It is about knowing your own value so clearly that the room has to adjust to you instead of the other way around. I walked into Caldwell and Pierce as someone who had been taught in 100 small and large ways that she needed to earn the right to exist in certain spaces. And I left, I'm still there, still in that building, still building, knowing that I never needed permission. I only needed to stop waiting for someone to give it to me. As for Nathan Cole, he is still the CEO. He still has his rule, but something in the way that building operates shifted quietly around the edges in the months after everything I just told you. People talk a little more, walls come down a little easier, and I don't take credit for all of it, but I know what I know. I didn't break his rule to get something from him. I broke it because I refused to disappear, because I walked in with secondhand heels and borrowed confidence and the deep, unshakable knowledge that I had earned my place in that room, and I was not going to make myself smaller to make that room more comfortable. Not for a rule, not for a system, not for anyone. And that, right there, is the most powerful thing a black girl from nothing can do in a room full of everything. If this story sat with you, if some part of it felt like yours, I need you to share it. Send it to the woman in your life who's been shrinking. Send it to the girl who's about to give up on the application she thinks is out of her league. Subscribe to this channel because every single week I bring you stories about women who chose themselves when everything around them said don't. And before you go, drop in the comments the one moment in your life when you refuse to disappear. I read every word, every single one. I'll see you next week.